So, to those cellular adhesion molecules specifically, all right, because this is one that we're not going to cover quite as much when we talk about cellular transport. But cellular adhesion molecules, CAMs, all right, are going to kind of help guide cells that are on the move in your body. So a nice example of these is the idea of like red blood cells. All right, red blood cells are a perfect example. White blood cells, another perfect example of cells that are moving through your body and aren't stationary. This is going to help cells that are responsible for touching or binding to other surfaces. And these cellular adhesion molecules are going to play a wide range of roles. For example, the idea that embryonic cells that form the placenta. Well, if you have the embryo that's going to need to be able to grow cells out towards the uterine wall and formulate this, placenta, it's going to be kind of important for there to be, if you think about cellular adhesion molecules, adhesion means to like stick to something. So the idea that these cells are kind of forming to go out and stick to the wall of the uterus. It also plays a role in establishing neural connections, right, for memory and thinking and learning. So the idea that they need to be able to communicate, get really close to each other, and do what they need to do. In this particular picture, we're showing how white blood cells are going to be where the cellular adhesion molecules play a role. Now I need you to keep in mind that those cellular adhesion molecules are still proteins on the cell membrane or in the cell membrane. All right, we're still talking about some part of the cell membrane, a structural component of the cell membrane. So what's actually going to happen here is that we've got a problem, that we have an injury site. All right, we've got a splinter that's come through and that has broken the surface or ruptured a blood vessel. So obviously you're going to have bleeding, you have a site of injury, and we need white blood cells to get to this site of injury to kind of begin the repair process and start everything going in the right direction. But the problem is that you've got blood flow just kind of like rushing past this injury site, and meanwhile we've got blood spilling out, right? And that blood is just flowing right on by. So how are the white blood cells ever going to just, suddenly stop the flow? Instead, what actually happens is this molecule called selectin, which is one of these cellular adhesion molecules. Selectin is going to play a role in kind of slowing down the flow. So what it actually does is it coats the cell to slow it down. So suddenly the white blood cell has a bit more traction, and it can kind of really like drag itself along the walls, however you want to think about it, to slow itself down. At the same time, you're going to have a different cellular adhesion molecule called integrin, which is on the cell membrane, and integrin's job is to anchor the cell. All right, what it's actually going to do is it's going to anchor the cell onto the walls of the blood vessel and kind of cling it there so that it can squeeze its way out of the actual vessel and come out into this space and accumulate around the injury site in order to form swelling and pus. And that swelling and pus is kind of going to start that whole idea of repair and getting everything moving in the right direction. So this is a perfect example of how cellular adhesion molecules are necessary in the cell membrane in order to kind of, that cell membrane is that outside layer of the cell, and without these little proteins that are embedded in certain spots to be able to slow down the movement of the white blood cell, to be able to help the white blood cell cling to the walls of the vessel in order for it to get to the specific location site, that injury site, and not just flow on by. We also have in our cell membrane specific things that are called intercellular junctions. And intercellular junctions are going to be what are connecting our cell membranes of neighboring cells. We have three different types of intercellular junctions. We've got tight junctions, desmosomes, and gap junctions. So we really have three different types. We've got 1, 2, and 3 types of intercellular junctions. 3 different ways that cells are going to be connected to one another when they're nearby. I think it's pretty safe to say a tight junction is pretty self-explanatory. That's when the cell membranes of adjacent cells are actually going to be fused together, all right? And the idea that that fusion is going to create a really tight, packed cell structure, and it's not really going to allow for a whole lot to move between the cells. I didn't really do a very good job of indicating that here. A really good example is the blood-brain barrier. Right, and that blood-brain barrier, if you look into your textbook a little, there's a whole entire section for you guys to read that kind of indicates just how the blood-brain barrier works and how those tight junctions, that tight-knit connection between the cells is what allows the blood-brain barrier to do its job and keep the things within the central nervous system where they belong, and keeping the blood and all the other materials out of that particular area, because they should really be operating separate and not be coming in contact with one another. Then we have desmosomes, and our desmosomes are going to be little areas where we have 2 cells that are nearby with one another, and they're actually going to have a specific location where they're kind of reinforced to connect one another. And that reinforcement is going to allow them to kind of have a connection, but it's not going to be that tight of a connection, so there's still going to be movement between the cells. And then we have gap junctions. And gap junctions are going to be a really good example of how 2 cells are going to be able to kind of communicate with one another. And there's actually going to be a channel that gets formed between these 2 cells so that they can relay messages back to one another and communicate. In this particular table, what we're actually looking at is relating the type of cellular junction, intercellular junction, to its specific function, and giving a good example of where it occurs within the body. So the idea that tight junctions, those cells are going to be so tightly fused together that it's almost going to be sheet-like. They're going to be this like giant sheet. For example, in the small intestines, the lining of the small intestines, the cells are going to be so tightly packed that larger molecules aren't going to be able to pass out of the small intestine. It's only going to be those small, broken down, digested materials that are able to be absorbed out of the small intestine. In addition, desmosomes, that's that spot weld, all right? For example, the outer skin layer, all right? In the outer skin layer, it is relatively packed together, but it's kind of that in between. That desmosome is going to be, yes, they're tightly packed together, but not as tight as a tight junction. They're going to be connected, but only in certain spots, so that there's almost a breathability to that outer skin layer. And then those gap junctions forming those channels, all right, from cytoplasm to cytoplasm, allowing things to flow. Examples, muscle cells of the heart, so that muscle cells of the heart can really communicate with one another so that the heartbeat can occur with all of the cells in a particular chamber simultaneously contracting. Similarly, the digestive tract, they need to be able to communicate to know that all the cells in those particular areas should be doing the same job at the same time. So those gap junctions allows for that kind of communication. This is just kind of giving an example of intercellular junctions, showing that here we have that gap junction. As you can see, there's that channel, right, or that tunnel that things can flow through. Desmosome, this is going to be where we've got that spot weld. We've got that one location where everything is kind of like connected. You see these little like connecting fibers that are really making sure that the junction is held together in a specific area, versus that tight junction where they're like just right up against one another, and really not allowing a whole lot of space in between.